What's wrong with marriage permanence doctrine? Part 3. Hi, welcome to today's little lesson. It's a joy to be with you. Even if you don't agree with me, I love you and I'm doing my best to try to help you see it my way, because this is my teaching. And I know I'm going to get a lot of negative comments on these videos, but just, ask you to do it in love and don't fight. Okay, but we're talking about the quote-unquote marriage permanence doctrine. I call it the divine divorce doctrine. It basically says anyone who's divorced and remarried, is living in adultery, non-stop adultery, and they then, should divorce again, and they should, if possible, go back to their first spouse, because in God's eyes, quote unquote, they're allegedly married to that person until death do us part. Okay, so there's some truth, but it falls short. So, let's look at what the Scripture has to say, not just one verse, but let's look at a couple verses. One, of course, would be one of the very first times, apparently, that Jesus even mentioned this subject, broached this subject in the Sermon on the Mount. He said, I'm reading from Matthew 5, verse 31, Jesus said, it was said. Now, notice he didn't say, Scripture says, or God says, or it was accurately, this is an accurate quote. No, it was said, quote, whoever sends his wife away, let him give her a certificate of divorce, end quote. I submit to you, it never says that anywhere, and I challenge anyone, show me where it says that in the Old Covenant. Okay, so Jesus is not quoting what the Old Covenant says or the Mosaic Law says. He's quoting what the scribes and Pharisees are teaching about divorce about divorce. In other words, the main thing is, if you send your wife away, make sure you give her that certificate. That's what they harp on. But you can divorce your wife for basically any cause. But Jesus says, now, here's his counterpoint to the Pharisaical teaching of his day. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, there's one clause that's put in here, an exception, except for the reason of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Woo! Okay? Now, again, can you see that Jesus he's not going to contradict anything that the law of Moses says, for goodness sakes. He's the author of the law of Moses. He's ministering to people who are under the law of Moses. Then if the new covenant changed things, the new covenant hasn't started. It's not going to start for about 3 years yet, okay? So, and basically the fundamental premise that Jesus changed basic fundamental morality under the new covenant is wrong anyways, but I don't have time to go into that. But again, Jesus is elaborating on the law, trying to bring clarification of what the law is really teaching. And this is what he's saying. Essentially, the law is teaching that in God's eyes, when a man divorces his wife, except in the case of unchastity, he makes her commit adultery. And then the man who marries his ex-wife, he's committing adultery as well in God's eyes. And of course, other places, I think in Luke or Mark, it talks about how he commits adultery when he gets remarried and so forth. Okay, so does that mean that Jesus wants everyone who's divorced and remarried to divorce again? Okay, no, absolutely not, because they're not. The basic premise of the marriage partner folks is that you're married to that original person until they die. And that's the permanence of marriage. That's where they get the phrase, the permanence of marriage. And so therefore the only remedy for your adultery is to divorce your current wife, and if possible, go back to your first husband. However, here's what Jesus said in Deuteronomy chapter 24, starting in verse number 1. When a man takes a wife and he marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out from his house. So it's his wife. They're married. He writes a certificate of divorce, so that indicates that they're divorced, at least legally divorced, and he gives her that certificate and he sends her out. So I mean, they're done, right? They're done. And she leaves his house, verse 2, and goes and becomes another man's wife. So now she's married a second time. Now, by Jesus' definition, she's now an adulteress in some sense because, she made a lifelong covenant with her first husband. Now again, he divorced her, so she's not to blame for the divorce. At least we can't find any evidence for that. I mean, he divorced her. He gave her the certificate, so she's like the victim. But in one sense, she's an adulteress because she had a covenant with this guy, and she leaves his house and goes and becomes another man's wife. Now, verse 3. If the latter husband turns against her, so the second husband, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her to be his wife, you get all that? So she's been twice married, but now the second husband either divorces her or dies. Here's what she is prohibited from doing. Then her former husband, who sent her away, is not allowed to take her again to be his wife. Oh my goodness. So they must not actually be still married in God's eyes. No, they're not still married in God's eyes, because if she, by remarrying, committed adultery, that then is what severs the covenant that she had with her first husband. If God wasn't recognizing it, at the time of her divorce, in God's eyes, she wasn't actually divorced. When she remarried this other guy and consummated her marriage with him, now she's an adulteress according to Jesus, right? In relationship to her first husband, that's who she's committed adultery against. And that relationship now is over. It's been severed by adultery. That's why Jesus said, whoever divorces his wife except for the reason of unchastity makes her commit adultery. So if in fact she has been unfaithful to him and he divorces her because of her unfaithfulness, that's a legitimate divorce. Because why? Because adultery is the breaking of the covenant. It severs and ends the relationship. Period. Okay? And so when the marriage permanence folks say, well, Jesus said whoever divorces and remarries commits adultery, and you're continually committing adultery, non-stop adultery, and the only way out of that is to divorce again. Au contraire, Monsieur. When that marriage was consummate, that second marriage was consummate, yes, an element of adultery existed in that because of what transpired before. But at that act, that, in some sense, adulterous act, that ended the covenant that existed with the first husband. And that's proven by not only Matthew and Deuteronomy chapter 24, which forbids the twice married woman to go back to her first husband, but also by what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, because he made an exception for why a man could, the man who illegitimately divorces his wife, there's an exception to that rule if she's been unfaithful, because then the covenant's been severed and there's freedom to remarry. Okay, so maybe one more time we'll look at this, okay? And I know I'm going to get all kinds of disagreement, but hey, I'm doing my best. Okay, thanks for joining me. Hope to see you next time.